Obama has been going on for a long, long time.
I want to bring in my panel, CNN senior political analyst and former advisor to 4 presidents, David Gergen, Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times, Lynn Sweet, CNN political analyst and presidential historian Julian Zelizer, and also with us, civil rights attorney Charles Coleman. David, President Trump did not call out a group or specific movement in the country as holding responsibility for this violence today. Why not? It seems like white nationalists and these far-right racists are a safe group to condemn.
The president's had a very hard time coming to grips with the fact that he has a lot of support from white supremacists. They were part of his campaign. He was very gingerly about distancing himself from them. But I think Andre argued in the last hour, we don't know a lot of things, and that's true. There are still some facts to come in. But we do know one thing that's clear. The president, in saying we've had violence and hatred and bigotry on many sides, he repeated that on many sides, did equate. He placed a moral equivalency between the neo-Nazis and the people who showed up today to defend racial justice. He essentially, and in doing that, and by putting an equivalence on, he in effect defended the neo-Nazis. That in effect was a defense. You know, everybody does it. Everybody out there is doing it. Everybody has to calm down. I'm sorry. What we have to be very clear about is, a second thing is, yes, there is a First Amendment protection for freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, but it is not an unfettered right. You do not have a right under the First Amendment. The courts have been quite clear about that. You do not have a right to use language that incites violence. And when you have groups marching through Charlottesville, as they were, chanting anti-Semitic slurs, when they are going after blacks, when they're saying take this country back and make it a white-dominated country again, that's an incitement to violence, and that's what we then had. Primary responsibility then for the violence rests with those people who are the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists and the other extremists.
Lynn, your reaction to the president's response to the deadly violence. I mean, even in that last tweet, he says deepest condolences to the families and fellow officers of the VA state police who died, referencing those who were killed in the helicopter crash, but he still has not specifically even talked about the person who was killed in that car that plowed into the crowd that was involved in this event.
So if anyone thinks that with the new chief of staff, he's getting better advice if he wants to tweet, or his communications team that he has now, or anyone can influence him, well, we guess that's not happening. Let me underscore, President Trump could have used his tweet to do a makeover, to remedy the criticisms that have been flowing on Twitter and everywhere else, that he did a moral, as David said, he made it seem as if both sides are equal, and that is a false equivalency in this case. You had a protest started by white nationalists and anti-Semites, and that is groups that you could and should call out when you're talking about an event that did lead to violence and where someone died. In this country, you can respect First and Second Amendment rights and still call out racism and anti-Semitism when it occurs, as it did in Charlottesville, as Senator McAuliffe was able to do in his comments. President Trump doesn't do it either because he knows very deliberately that is what this situation is. He's not doing it, or he doesn't know, and that's why he doesn't do it. Both potential reasons don't speak well now either for the president or the advice that he's getting.
Of course, Lynn, we've seen the president double down on comments in the past when he's been criticized. Do you think that he's making a point not to go there in these tweets specifically because he's been criticized for his initial comments?
Well, yes. And one other thing, what I am saying is separate than what the political calculation could be, because I'm sure what he said takes him as far as he wants to for his base, who probably doesn't want that he may fear he loses support if he specifically calls out David Duke. And there is staffers who must have been watching television today who saw David Duke embrace President Trump to say, we hope this kind of rally really shows I'm paraphrasing, he needs to deliver on his promise. And then I know, Anna, you've been hesitant about giving that man any more publicity, but certainly if the president is advised, he needs to incorporate that if he chooses in his messages. And by not doing that, you come to the conclusion with the staffing he now has, it's an omittance that is done with perhaps some thought.
Charles, this rally today definitely sends a message that these white supremacists are emboldened right now.
Sure, absolutely. Anna, I really want to make a point that this is an egregious display of leadership from the White House, in as much as when you compare Donald Trump's rhetoric throughout the campaign and throughout his early days of being president with respect to charging Barack Obama for saying radical Islamic terrorism and calling that out for what it is, and now him soft-shoeing around being able to say white nationalism, being able to say domestic terrorism in instances where it is clear and present in front of all of our faces being what it is. I think that when you compare his remarks to the tough talk that he's given to Vladimir Putin, to Kim Jong-il in North Korea, and then you look at how he soft-shoe around this issue, it's beyond disappointing. It's deplorable. And I want to make another point. One of the things that's being lost in this discussion is who the targets of these white nationalists are, who the targets of these white supremacists are. These are people of color. These are people who are living on the fringes of America. And when we heard Donald Trump talk about law and order, when we heard Jeff Sessions talk about law and order, this is what we knew he meant. This is what white supremacists knew he meant. David Duke tweeted out that he voted for Trump because of this, because this is what they expected. We all saw this coming, and it reminds me of a quote that I love, and that is, you cannot hustle controversy for profit, or in other cases for political expediency, because you are playing with forces with which you cannot control. And everyone who has allowed dog whistle politics to go on unfettered and unchecked with language that we all knew what was it about, and we never stopped it, to this point, we fertilized the ground, or we watched other people fertilize the ground upon which this has actually happened, and now it's ripe. And I want to also make a point that there are Charlottesvilles all over the United States. And if we're not careful, if we don't react to this the way that we need to as a country, from our leadership on down, we will continue to see this sort of thing happen. And people of color have been watching this situation, knowing that it was only a matter of time before this exploded.
But did you hear a dog whistle in the comments the president made today?
I absolutely did. And that is when he refused to go there, and when he refused to talk about white nationalism, and when he refused to label this as domestic terrorism, for someone who has as much conversation on the issues of terrorism and foreign terrorism and Islamic terrorism that he wants to label, to not be able to talk tough about this and demonstrate leadership in this moment, that's absolutely a dog whistle that emboldens white supremacists to keep doing what they're doing. And we've heard this dog whistle before today. When you talk to law enforcement, you tell them, rough folks up, don't be gentle. Those are the types of language, the lexicon, the rhetoric that gives all of the signals and all of the whistles to the folks who are emboldened in this instance to do what they're doing.
Julian, what kind of presidential test is this situation right now for the president?
This has already been a big test, and it's been a stunning display of presidential indifference. And sometimes you learn a lot about a president, not by what they say, but by what they don't say. And at first, he didn't even condemn the rally before the violence broke out. Here's a major rally of white nationalism in 2017, and you didn't hear anything from the president. And this fits a pattern that we've seen all the way back through the campaign. And then I think the statements he has made in the last few hours have explicitly been a choice about not talking about white nationalism, making it's both sides and both sides have to calm down. And so this has been a big test, and I think at this point he has come down on the side of really not making a strong statement about what's going on in Charlottesville, and this will be part of his legacy.
Anna, it borders on the offensive, if not to be an all-out aberration for him to suggest we need to study what's going on. Let's put this in the proper historical context. Virginia was home to 2 out of the 3 known Confederate capitals during the Civil War. This has been a space that the racial tensions in this state, in this area, are well documented. They're well known. Anyone could have seen, based off of what had been planned and based off of the events of last night, where this weekend was headed and where this was going. And for the president not to get in front of this, for the president not to speak out on it, for the president not to clearly identify white nationalism and domestic terrorism for being what it is, clearly shows his indifference, and it is part of his legacy. And I, quite frankly, I think it's a legacy he's comfortable with.
Well, I really appreciate the thoughtful discussion. Everybody stand by. I appreciate it. Got to squeeze in a quick break. We'll be right back.